Alright, welcome to part 2 of the pivot table trainings, where we'll learn a little bit more than just base foundational, but we're going to learn more about how to do calculations within a pivot table. Alright, so the objective of this one is to provide training on the following topics: how to create a calculated field within a pivot table, how to use show value as within a pivot table, how to activate and deactivate subtotals, and how to change the way the pivot table summarizes a column or row's value. Alright, so the first one we're going to work on is how to create a calculated field within a pivot table. So, in the last video I told you that your pivot table is based off of your underlying data. So our underlying data has headings of period, quarter, year, total retail sales, and e-commerce. If you go back to our base data, that is what you see up here. However, based on our information here, and say your boss comes up to you and says, hey, how much did we do in brick and mortar sales during a specific quarter or year, you'd either have to do one of two things. You would either have to go back over here, put in a brick and mortar heading, calculate it all out, then sort and do the math. Or you could just do it right here in the pivot table. And by doing the way you do that is to go up here to Pivot Table Analyze. Now, before I go into Pivot Table Analyze, I want to give you one tip. The only way this shows up or design shows up is if you're clicked inside the pivot table. If you click outside of the pivot table, both of those disappear. So they're only active and only able to be seen if you are inside the pivot table. Just a little tip. Alright, so now we're going to do a calculation. We're going to calculate brick and mortar sales inside the pivot table. And what it's going to do is it's going to add another field over here. So this is where you'll see you can actually have more fields in your field list than you actually do in your base data. Alright, so let's do that. So let's go over here to Pivot Table Analyze because we're clicked inside our pivot table. We're going to go over here to Fields, Items, and Sets. We're going to click on Calculated Field. And then we're just going to, it comes with this box called Insert Calculated Field. And we're going to name what we're going to make our calculation. And we're going to call it brick and mortar sales. Then below it is a formula. Well, our formula is just total retail sales minus e-commerce sales. And we're going to click OK. And voila, there you go. You see now you have a column that's been calculated off of total retail sales and e-commerce sales that created brick and mortar sales. It also added it over here, as I told you. So now you have more calculations or fields, over here in your field list than you do in your base data. The good thing about this is, as long as you have a calculation built into the pivot table, no matter how many times you refresh or you add new records, it will automatically calculate and leave that column there. So you never have to worry about changing your underlying data pool because you might have forgot to add brick and mortar sales. The pivot table is already done for you. It's calculated. Alright. Now, what about if the question now is, well, on a quarterly or annual basis, or let's just say quarterly basis, what is the penetration of e-commerce sales into total sales? And what is our penetration of brick and mortar? Well, this is another calculation that you can easily do within the pivot table. Again, that did not exist over here, but we can add it over here. So, again, Pivot Table Analyze, Fields and Sets, Calculated Field, and we want to know e-commerce penetration, total sales. Formula, e-commerce divided by total retail sales. We're going to click add. And by clicking add instead of OK, it kind of reacts the same way as defer layout update. It will add it over here in your field list, but it will not make any changes to your layout or any different calculations until you tell it to and say it's OK. So we're going to go back over here and do one for brick and mortar. So that we have one for both. And we got brick and mortar divided by by total retail sales. And now we're going to click OK. And it added both in here. But you're like, whoa, 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 that's currency. Should be a percent. You're correct. What happens when you do a calculation, it automatically puts it in the same way as the base data. So since our base data was in currency, it's set up as currency. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on the cell, right click, value field settings, go down to number format, click percentage, add 1 decimal, and click OK. Then we're going to do the same thing for brick and mortar, right click, value field settings, number format, percentage, add 1 decimal, click OK. Alright, so now we can answer the question that our boss asked us, and it took us seconds to get it done. So now if they asked, well, let's say they say in 2001, and we want to know in the first quarter how big of penetration was e-commerce. Well, it was 1.1% of total sales, and brick and mortar represented 98.9. All right. So let's say we want to know, say they want to know within a specific year by quarter, what did the penetration of e-commerce sales? Well, like I told you before, pivot tables are agile and flexible. Versus base data, you would have to do a lot more work. So all we have to do, bring year down here, and now we have our year and our quarters. All right. Well, if they say, tell me about 2005, then I can sit here and go up here to my filter, or my little drop down, which is a filter, click on 2005 only, and click OK. So now I know that in 2005, e-commerce sales accounted for 2.3% of total retail sales, and brick and mortar was 97.7%. And I can do that for any year as asked. But what if they say, why don't you tell me what e-commerce represents on a quarterly basis for us so we know how to plan if we have a target of hitting $100,000? Well, that's a very simple thing to do. Again, it's not over here in your base data, but it's easy to create the answer. So we can go over here and we can either create a new pivot table, which is what I'm going to do right now just by copying and pasting our original one, or we could have done it in our original pivot table. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add it in now, and I'm going to say in 2005, I'm going to try to find out what Q2 represents as a percentage of full year e-commerce sales. Now, the thing about pivot tables, again, very agile, very flexible. I can take e-commerce sales and I can add it back in here a second time. I can do the same thing for brick and mortar, and you say, well, that was a calculation. Yes, it was. But I can add it in here again anyway and do math off of it. So I'm going to go over here to e-commerce sales, and just so you know, we're going to be doing number 2 now, how to use show value as within a pivot table. I just go over here, I right click, I go to value field settings again, and there's 2 tabs up here, but a lot of people ignore this second tab as if it doesn't exist. If you click on it, you'll see where it says no calculation. Click on that, And our data is in a column format right now. So we need to do percent of column total and click OK. And we'll do the same thing over here on the brick and mortar. Value field settings, show value as, no calculation, percent of column total, click OK. So now what we can see to answer the question is that in Q2 of 2005, e-commerce sales represents 24.4%. So if I was going to try to get a full year target of 100,000, I would know that directionally I would sit there and say that Q2 is worth about 24%, almost 24.5. So that way they could forecast or budget 24% of the $100,000 into Q2 of 2005 or 2006 or whatever year it is. All right. Now, what you need to realize is that if I didn't want the quarters to be, I want my information to go like this, instead I wanted to go up and down, then I would sit there and have to take my data in my layout and I would just switch it around. Now the problem with this is, and I did this on purpose to be able to show, is originally when we built this calculation for what percentage it equals in a quarter, it was all calculated out, made sense, it's good to go. But because we flipped it from column format to row format, it takes away the calculation, so it no longer makes sense. So in order to fix that, you have to click in it, right click, go back to value field settings, go back to show value as, and instead of percent of column total, you just do percent of row total. Click OK, and now your information, you're going to do the same thing on brick and mortar, percent of row total is back to the information you had before. It's just when you use show value as, you have to do it in the way that makes sense. So if you do columns and your data is originally in columns, then you use percent of column total. If it's in a row, percent of row total. And there's different ways and different things you can do under show value as, but those are probably the two most common people will probably use. All right, now the next thing we're going to do is how to activate and deactivate subtotals. All right, so we're going to copy and paste this pivot table down, paste, and we're going to change our layout. And we're going to put year back down here, quarter back down here, move the values back up here, and what do I want to do? Yeah, I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to add back in all of our years. I'm going to get rid of 1999, I'm going to get rid of any blanks. And the reason why I keep on getting rid of 1999 is it only has one record, so it doesn't really do much for me. But the other thing I'm going to do, because I don't really need a lot of this other data, I'm going to remove it. So get rid of brick and mortar, blah, 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 blah. And I'll delete e-commerce, I'll leave that one. I'll reformat. All right, so the next thing we're going to work on is number 3, how to activate and deactivate subtotals. All right, so sometimes you don't want to have to use the filter up top and get rid of all your other data just to be able to provide an answer. So if we were to sit here and say we want to know what the total retail sales was for 2002, we could either go in here, highlight all of them, look down here at the bottom corner and get our number. Or we can go back to our base data, do the same thing, find all the ones for 2002, add them up, and get the same information. Or we could take a year and we can move it up here, and we can just get rid of everything else, and we can do 2002, and it'll give us all of our information. But what if we want to see all the information at one time, but we just want to see it summarized by year? Well, then we bring our year back down here, open up all of our data, again, getting rid of 1999 and blanks, and we use what they call subtotals. Now there's a couple of ways to activate subtotals. So the quick and dirty way is just click on the column you want to subtotal, right click, go up here to where it says subtotal year, click on that, and now if you're asked how much you did in sales in 2000 and they want to know by quarter, you can give it to them. It's summarized by year. You can go down to 2006, you can give them brick and mortar for 2010. It's all summarized. The other way you could have, I'm going to deactivate this now using the same way I just activated it. Just click on it, right click on it, or click on it to activate it. To get the box there, just right click on it, subtotal year, and it takes it off by unclicking that subtotal year. The second way you could have did it is go up here to design, and on the ribbon in design, the very first one is subtotals. So you click on subtotals, and you can go show all subtotals at bottom of group, and it's the same thing. And if you want to deactivate it, just go to do not show subtotals, and it's removed. That simple. That's subtotals in a nutshell. Alright, the last thing we're going to work on to fulfill our training objective is how to change the way the pivot table summarizes a column or row's values. Well, what we got down here is a pivot table that just has purely total retail sales, summer e-commerce, brick and mortar sales, and we have our year. Alright, this time we have pulled out the quarter information, so we just summarize it purely to an annual basis. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to change excuse me, we're going to change total retail sales and e-commerce, and then you're going to see a kind of something like a little tip that's going to give you here, but it's going to be, you're going to see a surprise with brick and mortar sales. Alright, so in order to change total retail sales into a different format or a different type of value to summarize it, what you're going to do is go over here to total retail sales, and we're going to click on value field settings, and we're just going to change it to count, which is located under summarize values by. So we're just going to change that to count. We're going to go down here to number format, and we're going to, since it's a count, we're going to make sure it's a number, and we're going to click OK. And click OK. And we're going to do the same thing, except instead of going over here this time and changing it, a second way you can do it is right in the column, right click, value field settings, again change it to count, again double down that it's in number format, which it is, click OK, and it's going to change it into a number. And now this is where your surprise comes in with brick and mortar sales. Remember that this was a calculated field. So if we go under here and do the same thing, change it to count, number format, make sure it's number, click OK, and click OK, nothing is going to happen. And the reason why nothing happens is because it's not in our base data. We use this as a calculated field, and since we utilize this as a calculated field, and it's not in our base data, we cannot get a count of records because there is no records that exist. Remember, the pivot table is based off of your base data's information. So in this case, with this pivot table, we're just going to remove the brick and mortar information. Now, what do these fours represent? Well, in every one of these years, we have 4 different quarters: Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. So in every one of these years, these quarters, or these fours, represent the total number of quarters in the year. Now let's say our data was months and our records were days. Well, if it was months or days, we'll know that some months we should see 28 days, others 30, and others 31. And if it's a leap year, we'll see one month with 29. So depending on how many records fall under your headings will depending on how many that it counts. And that's pretty much it. It's that simple. So that is how to change the way the pivot table summarizes a column or row's values.